Hello. So I think we could be resuming our lecture. So in the first session then we, of course, talked about the first period and second period, and I really enjoyed your questions and comments. So let us just keep on this good momentum for the third period as well as the fourth period as well. So the third period, that is from 1980 to 1997, what were the challenges at the time? Well, in fact, you could say success was the challenge at the time because Korean economy developed, and I keep on telling you about the meaning of 1986. And then by 1986, then large number of countries around the world, they were looking at Korea and then said, well, Korea, you are no longer a small boy. You must understand you're a big boy. And you must behave like a big boy. And then it was back in 1984, it was the first year that United States, in fact, it imposed something called anti-dumping measure against a Korean product. Can you guess what was the first ever Korean product which was subject to anti-dumping measure by the United States? Can you guess? Please. Good guess, but at the same time, it was last year, but at the same time, the first Korean product which met with anti-dumping measure by the United States, that was color television being manufactured by Samsung. So Samsung color television, it in fact ended up with the honor of being the first Korean product that was subject to anti-dumping measure by the United States. But at the same time, it was just beginning. Then there were other measures that in fact were imposed on Korea. One of them was something called Section 301 measure. These days we hear a lot about Section 301 measure. The United States, in fact, imposing this Section 301 measure in a big way against which country? Can you guess? These days, United States is imposing a huge Section 301 measure against which country? China, of course, right? But back in the 1980s, then United States was imposing Section 301 measure against Korean products, right? In various different areas, insurance, and IPR, tobacco, etc., etc. So there was one pressure coming from outside world, right, back in 1980s. That, in fact, is the reason why I said it was a challenge arising from economic success, right? But at the same time, there was another challenge, which in fact came from within our own economy, which is, as Korean economy began to grow, then the issue arose about how to further promote productivity. Because the size was growing larger, but at the same time, productivity, it was lagging. So how to promote productivity of the Korean economy? It was our own internal challenge. So we had to meet those challenges. That was the challenge of the time. Challenge arising from economic success, from the outside world in the form of anti-dumping measure, in the form of Section 301 measure, but at the same time, from our own internal source, which was how to promote Korea's productivity, Korean economy's productivity. So that was the challenge of the time. And then how did we meet those challenges? We tried to meet those challenges through something called, quote-unquote, liberalization. We tried to meet those challenges through further liberalizing Korean economy. So the first thing I should be telling you about is 5-year tariff reduction plan. Well, in the second period, we discussed about Korea's 5-year economic development plan, which started in 1962. 20 years later, we were having another 5-year plan. This time, it was a 5-year plan to reduce Korean tariffs, which started in 1983. So when we started that autonomous, voluntary, purely voluntary tariff reduction plan, Korea's average tariff rate, it was 23%. more than 23%. After 10 years, when we were done with this voluntary autonomous tariff reduction plan, it came down to 7.9%. But at the same time, there were other measures we kept on introducing for further liberalization of the Korean economy. And then, of course, there was Uruguay round negotiations, which I already told you about. And then in Uruguay round, then, of course, there were new areas of liberalization which were introduced into the GATT system, which is now WTO system. And they were, of course, trade in services was introduced into the GATT system. IPR was introduced into the WTO system. DSU, that is to say dispute settlement understanding, was introduced into the WTO system. But at the same time, along with services, along with intellectual property, along with dispute settlement system, then again, tariff reduction for industrial products was a very important issue. And at the time, we didn't have this expression, which is NAMA. NAMA is for, well, manufactured products, reduction of tariffs for manufactured products. When it comes to tariff reduction, Korea, in fact, among all the GATT members at the time, Korea, in fact, was the second best performing negotiating country in terms of the size or significance of tariff reduction. So there was another major effort Korea made in the area of liberalization. And Korea, in fact, introduced our own system of ODA quite early. That in fact, was introduced back in 1987. And then in 1988, we accepted Article 8 obligation of IMF agreement. What we mean by Article 8 obligation is this, which is that, well, so far, I talked about liberalization, and then all those measures I told you about Korea's liberalization, that was in the area of trade in goods, right? These liberalization I told you about, they were in the area of trade in goods. But, well, in order to trade, then of course you need money, right? And then this is something I told you in the first period, I told you in the second period. Korea was always short of money, especially foreign exchange. And then because of it, Korea in fact was imposing various different kinds of restrictions on the movement of capital, on the movement of money, right? In 1988, what we did was, of course, Korea was, by the time, Korea was, of course, a member of IMF, but Korea was taking an exception from application of Article 8 of, IMF agreement. What it meant was, in current account means, well, the capital movement related with trade in goods and trade in services. So when you trade in goods or when you trade in services, then of course there is movement of capital. And movement of capital related with trade in goods and trade in services, we call it current account. And Article 8 of IMF agreement, it allowed certain members who in fact were having difficulty in their management of foreign exchange to take an exception from complying with Article 8 of IMF agreement. What Korea did at the time was, well, we will graduate from this exception. We in fact will liberalize our current account movement. That happened in 1988. 1989, what did Korea do? Well, earlier in the second period, then one of your colleagues, she raised a question about Korea's developing country status in GATT. And one of the things Korea was benefiting from Korea's developing country status as a member of GATT was something called Article 18B exception. And Article 18B of GATT agreement at the time, it in fact allowed GATT members to take exceptional trade restrictive measures when they have difficulty in something called BOP. That's balance of payment. So that, in fact, was another special and differential treatment being allowed to developing countries of GATT, which was called Article 18B. And then up until that time, when I say that time, that was 1989, then Korea continued to benefit from that BOP exception under Article 18B of GATT agreement. 1989, we said we will graduate. So we no longer took exception under the cover of Article 18B of GATT. Article 1989, the same year, then we became a founding member of APEC. 1996, as I already told you, another major progress in Korea's progress towards liberalization, that was Korean accession to the OECD, which happened in 1996. I remember the OECD Council meeting on October 23rd, and it was at that OECD Council meeting which in fact decided to welcome Korea as a member of OECD. That happened on October 23rd, 1986. How do I remember the date, October 23rd? Because that is the birthday of my son. So that happened on October 23rd. And what was the meaning of Korea's accession to the OECD? I told you about all those liberalization measures we took in the area of trade in goods. And I told you all those liberalization measures we took in terms of current account movement. But at the same time, they were in those specific sectors. But we thought, well, OECD membership, it in fact will provide us with an opportunity to look at various laws and regulations and the systems we have in our government and then review them so that it will serve as one huge opportunity to be, in fact, taking necessary measures in order to further liberalize our economic system. So across the board measures rather than sector-specific measures. That, in fact, was Korea's motivation to join the OECD. And as I already told you, then in order to become the OECD member, we had to, go through examination in 11 different committees. And I was there as a member of Korean, at the time we didn't have delegation to the OECD. We had a kind of preparatory mission to negotiate Korean accession to the OECD. So I was already there as a member of that preparatory delegation. And I, in fact, participated in large number of examinations, but my responsibility was the trade committee. So I was participating in trade committee examination, but at the same time, there were two other very important committees we had to go through. One of them was CIMET, that is about movement of capital, and another was ELSA committee. It was about Korea's labor conditions. So they were the three important committees that we had to go through. And one of the questions which arose in the whole process was Korea's developing country status. And one of your colleagues raised that question already in the second period, so we can just skip it. 1998. Then what happened in 1998 was, 1997. When I say 1997, what comes up in your mind? 1997, we had something called Asian financial crisis. Asian financial crisis. And we had to go through it. How did we go through that Asian financial crisis? Through further liberalization of Korean economic system. We didn't raise up our protectionist war. We went just the other way around. We tried to meet the challenge through further liberalization. And one of the measures we took, I already told you about liberalization measures in trade in goods. I told you about liberalization measures we took in a current account movement. But another very important liberalization we took was, I already told you about OECD membership, Korea's accession to the OECD, and CIMET. CIMET membership meant, in a sense, large measure of liberalization measures we had to take in the movement of capital account. So Article 8 of IMF, it was about current account restrictions. But through Korea's accession to the OECD, especially the Committee of CMED, then we took large measures of liberalization measures for the capital account as well. What, in fact, remained as an important restrictive measure for Korea's external economic relationship was exchange rate system for Korea. Because up until that time, up until 1998, up until the Asian financial crisis of 1997, then, in fact, there were large, series of measures Korea took in order to further liberalize Korea's foreign exchange system. The free floating of Korean currency, it happened as a measure, series of measures Korea took in order to respond to the Asian financial crisis of 1997. So as I look back, I just think 1970s, from 1980 up until 1997, I think that period was the golden age of liberalization of Korean economy, but at the same time, it was not just the Korean economy. During that period of time, that is to say 1980 up until 1997, other Asian economies also took a large measure of liberalization. So I just look upon that period as golden age of liberalization. And then obviously, of course, diplomacy, Korean diplomacy and Korean diplomats had to play a very important role during that period of liberalization period. So that, I think, is for the third period. And your turn. Questions and comments.
So something that the United States has dealt with, where I'm from, is a growing wealth divide, which is sort of accompanied with the liberalization of our economy. So I'm curious if Korea has ever had to deal with a wealth divide or something of that matter during this time.
Well, could you repeat your question?
Yeah, so is Korea dealing with, or ever dealt with, especially during this time, a problem with like a wealth divide between the middle class and the lower class? Has that ever been an issue that had to be dealt with during this time?
Is the question about polarization of the economy? That question reminds me about one conversation I had with my Mexican colleague back in 1997. And as I already told you, Korea joined the OECD in 1996, which happened in December. The decision at the Council was made in October, but Korea's actual accession was done in December 1996. Just 1 year later, in 1997, then we met with Asian financial crisis. And then because of it, well, back in Seoul, people were saying, well, one of the reasons why we are meeting with IMF crisis, it is because our accession to the OECD was premature. That, in fact, was the complaint I often heard back in 1997. And then how do you think I would have felt by the complaint? Because, as I already told you, I was part of the team, member of the team, negotiating Korea's accession to the OECD, and people back home, they were saying, well, one of the reasons why we're having this crisis, it is because of premature accession to the OECD. I didn't like it. But at the same time, well, of course, I had to work. And I remember one conversation I had with my Mexican colleague at the time. He came to talk to me, and then he said, well, many years back, Mexico joined the OECD. 1 year after that accession, then we had Mexican financial crisis. And then we had exactly the same, complaint back in Mexico City, that Mexico joined OECD maybe too prematurely, and then that is the reason why we're having that financial crisis. But I don't believe in that. I mean, that's what that Mexican colleague told me, and of course I agreed with him. I did not think that Korea's accession to the OECD had anything to do with the financial crisis of 1997. One of the reasons why I thought that was not the case was because Korea was not the only country having that financial crisis in Asia. As I already told you, there was Indonesia, there was Malaysia, there were the Philippines, there was Thailand, and then all of those countries, of course, they didn't have anything to do with the OECD, but they were having the crisis all at the same time. So definitely it was not the reason. But what that Mexican colleague told me was this, which is, I know Korea, and then I know that you will be able to meet with this financial crisis soon enough. But there is one thing you have to remember, which is somehow this is something we experienced in Mexico, which is where there was a crisis and we met with those challenges, and one consequence of the challenge was, outcome of that crisis was, financial crisis was, somehow there was sharp rise in polarization, economic polarization in the Mexican economy. That may be something you will have to watch out, and that may be something you should be careful about. That, in fact, was something I heard from him and kept in my mind. Fortunately, that didn't happen in a conspicuous manner with the Korean economy. But it was after 2008 financial crisis, and then 10 years later, we had another financial crisis in 2008. Then, of course, we are already going into the fourth period. But anyhow, we could overcome or go through the financial crisis of 2008 without too much difficulty, right? But somehow, it was in the aftermath of 2008 that there were increasing signs in the Korean economy that, in fact, there is growing gap of income between the very rich and then the very poor. In other words, in a sense, sharp increase in polarization, economic polarization in the Korean economy. So that, in fact, to sum up what I just shared with you, was not much of an issue back in 1997 or 1998, which became a far bigger issue after the financial crisis of 2008. And I just wonder what could be the economic explanation for the growing economic polarization. Could crisis have something to do with it? Maybe, but at the same time, I think there would be a more important reason, which is fundamental and structural change in the economy. Fundamental and structural change in the economy, which is, well, these days what we are saying is this, which is that back in 1960s and 70s, economic growth, it translated itself into job growth and growth in income. That was 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So economic growth, it was always accompanied with growth in job and growth in income, which is not happening today. So maybe it has something to do with technology, maybe it has something more to do with the structural change of the economy. So crisis, financial crisis, could be partly explaining in the sense that one thing which happens, which always happens when you try to go through the financial crisis is of course the collapse of the middle income families, middle income households. That's what always happens during the time of financial crisis. So that in fact would be a part of the explanation. But telling from Korea's own national experiences of late 1970s and then after the financial crisis, global financial crisis of 2008, maybe there is certain other forces which are working for this growing economic polarization. So that's an issue in the United States. That's an issue in Korea. That's an issue in Western Europe. So, as a government official, I've been working on those issues, but now it is your turn. You should be coming up with more innovative ways of how to deal with these growing signs of economic polarization. Thank you. And then any other question?
So is there economic polarization between the younger generation and the older generation? So does the younger generation benefit more greatly from the economic development? And also, what does the welfare system in Korea do to bridge that gap between a richer younger generation and a poor old generation?
So what you are thinking is that there is general issue for this growing income gap, and then it is your view that younger generation is benefiting more from all these changes taking place in the economy, and then maybe this polarization could be happening because of older generation failing to adapt themselves to these changes in the economy. Is it your view?
Not failing, but being left out of it.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. Yeah, could be. But at the same time, well, this is something I already told you, which is that, well, Korea's economic development, that in fact happened, most of it happened in 1970s and 80s and 90s. And at the time, I, in fact, was a undergraduate student from between 1975 and 1978. And at the time, we didn't care too much about if we will end up with a good job after graduation. We thought, well, there are so many jobs. Whatever you do in college, whether you study hard or whether you just wine and dine, when you graduate, then you will end up with a good job. That's what we thought back in 1970s. And then it was not, well, the environment which in fact was encouraging you to study too hard. So that in fact was the situation at that time. So in other words, back in those days, 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, then people benefited hugely from this ship floating up with the ebb of water coming in. So everybody was just floating up. So job was not an issue, income was not an issue, economy was growing, everybody was benefiting from it. But at the same time, these days, it is not happening in Korea. It is not happening in Western Europe. It is not happening in the United States. That is to say, again, employment rate or unemployment rate is dropping down to historical levels in the United States, right? But somehow, income is not keeping up, right? The wage is not keeping up. So, well, in a sense, it is not necessarily generational gap, but I think it is more, say, the technology changing, and then it is not just generational question. I think it is younger generation as well who, in fact, will have to keep up with those changes taking place in the technology, taking place in the economy. Well, I think there is an Israeli philosopher by the name of Harari. Have you heard about something called Homo Deus? Homo Deus? Have you heard about that book, Homo Deus, written by Harari? And then there is Harari's view in the sense that, well, because of all these technological changes, if you can keep up and adapt yourself to these technological changes, then you, in fact, would be elevating yourself from Homo sapiens, that's 20th century human being, to Homo Deus of the 21st century. But if you fail to adapt yourself to the change, then you will end up with Homo hopeless. Homo hopeless. So if in the Homo sapiens in the 20th century, then there was more level playing field for all, well, citizens. That was during the period of Homo sapiens. Well, in the 21st century, then this gap between Homo Deus, human beings, equipped with all that knowledge and training and understanding of all those technological changes, who in fact would have significantly enhanced their capabilities and would be in a far more enhanced position than Homo sapiens of 20th century, so they would be Homo Deus. But if you fail to do that, then you will end up as Homo hopeless. So there will be huge gap between Homo Deus and then Homo hopeless. That was Harari's view. We don't have to necessarily subscribe to his view, but at the same time, I think the gist of your question was, well, this economic gap, is there any generational, say, factor involved in that economic gap? Maybe you could say, well, younger generation, they would be in a better position to adapt themselves. Older generation, less adept to be adapting themselves. So that could be an explanation. But at the same time, I think more important factor would be how capable you would be in adapting yourself to those changes, technological changes, and then structural changes taking place in the economy.
So one thing that's really unique about Korea's economic situation is the chaebol system that it has implemented. And I took a class last semester, and we learned that it really did help with Korea's economic situation, and it helped with its development. But a lot of critics are saying that it's time to move away from the system. Like, it did in fact help, but now there's this polarization kind of just to go off of her question. There's this sort of polarization of wealth within these huge companies. So I was just wondering what your opinion was on the whole chaebol system, and if you think that Korea should keep it as it is now, or if we should sort of break up the system and move away towards something less intensified.
Well, thank you for the question. Well, as a matter of fact, so far, we have talked about, on the one hand, Korea's economic development. On the other hand, there was a question about Korean political system. I mean, how authoritarian system impacted Korea's economic growth. And then just a minute ago, then we were discussing about this income gap, and then how that income gap, is in fact being in a sense, created and aggravated because of all those changes taking place in the technology, taking place in the structure of the economy. But at the same time, I think our friend is raising another very important factor, which is, what about chaebol system? Isn't chaebol system, which is uniquely Korean, isn't chaebol system responsible for this growing income gap in the Korean society? So that, in fact, is a third factor that we should be seriously thinking about income gap in the Korean society. And then, as I already told you about authoritarian rule, then somehow we could take necessary measures to move away from authoritarian system back in 1987. And then that adjustment that we have achieved as a society to that political system, at the end of the day, left a very positive impact upon Korea's development economically, politically, and then socially otherwise. So that's what I already told you in response to the question coming from one of your friends. And then I have to say the same thing about chaebol system. Why did chaebol grow the way it grew in the Korean economy? Well, when I was talking about the first period, then I told you about import substitution industry. And we should be very thankful for those, at the time they were of course not chaebols. They were small business houses. I personally, as well as I think Korea is a society, we should be feeling thankful to them in the sense that at the very least, they in fact started a very basis for Korea's industrial development, right? With very low level of technology, very low level of capital, very low level of institutionalization, but somehow they succeeded in doing it. And in the second period, this is something I already told you, in the second period, then Korea was busy to develop its economy. And Korea wanted to do it in a private sector driven way. And then that, I think, was a wise decision. Korea wanted to do it in a private sector driven way. We didn't let public and state enterprises to be playing an important role for Korea's economic development. We, in fact, at the time, we didn't have this concept of PPP, public-private partnership. But I think even if we didn't have that expression, we thought it should be the private sector which should be playing the leading role. So that, I think, is the reason why in 1960s and 70s, when government was trying to come up with fast export-driven industrialization, then they had to work with somebody. And then when they had to work with somebody, then of course there was LG, there was Samsung, there was Hyundai. They were already there, in a sense, participating in import substitution industries. And they had, in fact, the basic elements to go even further in terms of capital, in terms of technology, in terms of institutionalization. So in a sense, it was natural and logical choice for the government to work with them, right? And then as Korean economy grew, and all those business houses grew as well, to in fact grew into chaebols. So initially, when I say initially back in 70s and back in 80s and 90s, they in fact had far more positive contribution to make for Korea's national economic development. But at the same time, as everything in life, if it is too good, maybe it is too good, right? And then that heavy dependence upon chaebol, that in fact had many negative aspects as well. So that is the reason why in Korea we have FTC, Fair Trade Commission, and then that is the reason why I already told you about Korea being the 12th largest economy in the whole world. But when it comes to the influence of FTC as an institution, of course they have an FTC in the United States, and then they have equivalent institutions in Europe, etc., etc. And then if you compare those FTCs, somehow Korean FTC is a far more influential institution, far more, say, important role being played than 12th economy in the whole world. I mean, there are a large number of countries with larger economy than us, but at the same time, they are, well, in a sense, equivalent institutions of FTC. They are not as strong as Korean FTC. Korean FTC is a very strong institution, and I think we need a strong FTC. Why? Because of very peculiar way through which Korean economy grew, and then as I already told you, those chaebols made a huge contribution for the development of Korean economy, but at the same time, there were certain negative aspects of chaebol system, and then FTC was, in a sense, empowered to deal with those negative aspects of the Korean economy. And then as we moved away from authoritarian government system, then I think we should be moving away from too heavy dependence upon chaebols, and that, in fact, is a homework we've been dealing with so far, in a successful manner. Well, I think we are done with the questions, and then we can move to the fourth period.
Okay, so I would like to ask you a question about the third period that you were speaking about during the lecture.
Right.
And hearing you explaining the fast-paced change of the liberalization process that you had makes me think about, the way that South Korea proceeded through your plans and the way other countries have been doing it, because you went through a process of liberalization that other countries might have done in 200 years within just 50 years.
Right.
So my question is, what would you say has been seen as a side effect of this? Because in my perspective, there must be side effects when such fast changes is taking place. So what would you say are the main side effects of this fast change?
Well,
or has been?
Right. Well, I think I should be making several points. One, why it was the case that Korea was introducing all those quote-unquote liberalization measures at such fast-paced, in a sense, pace. What was the motivation for Korea? I think it was a combination of two factors. One, external pressure. Whether we liked it or not, then there was very heavy pressure coming from abroad. For example, coming from the United States. And then this is something I shared with you. I mean, anti-dumping measures. The first time we were exposed to anti-dumping, that was back in 1984. And to be frank with you, we didn't understand too much about what anti-dumping measure was. And then, this is a very technical detail, but the way United States conducts anti-dumping investigation, there are two institutions involved. Well, when it comes to injury, there will be no anti-dumping measure unless there is injury. Injury determination is made by an institution called ITC, International Trade Commission. But at the same time, you cannot impose anti-dumping measure unless there is dumping margin. calculation of dumping margin that is done by Department of Commerce. So there are two US federal agencies involved. On the one hand, ITC for injury determination. On the other hand, Department of Commerce for dumping margin calculation. I know it now. We didn't know it back in 1984. So there were a lot of pressure being, in a sense, imposed upon Korea. And then of course, it was followed by a large number of special Section 301 as well as special 301 measures. So whether we liked it or not, then we had to liberalize. There was an external pressure. But at the same time, the reason why we could so, well, in a sense, effectively in our efforts for liberalization, if it had been just external pressure, then I think internally there could have been resistance to the pressure, and resistance, and then it could have ended up by saying Korea taking half-hearted measures in the direction of liberalization. And then if that had been the case, then liberalization would not have ended up with all those positive impact upon the Korean economy. But the thing is, during the time when there was external pressure from abroad, even internally, we in fact were thinking that we need further liberalization. Why? Because, well, there was an American economist by the name of Paul Krugman, and then he wrote a very interesting article back in 1993. And then that article was, in fact, titled as Myth of Asian Miracle. Myth of Asian Miracle. And that article was written by somebody called Paul Krugman. And then what he tried to write in that article was, well, Asian economies, on the surface, they were doing very well. How did they develop the economy? I mean, Asian economies, how did they develop? They, in fact, developed the economies through, well, amplification of production factors, by which he meant they added labor, they added capital, and then it is purely on the size of labor, it is purely on the size of capital that Asian economies could develop the economy. But at the same time, there is another very important aspect to economic growth, which is growth in productivity. That, in fact, is qualitative growth versus quantitative growth. But if we analyze the contents of Asian economic development, it was mostly quantitative development. There was no qualitative development. That's what he wrote in 1993, Myth of Asian Miracle. And then he said, well, development of Asian economy, that's a myth. Why? Because there was no qualitative development. There was no growth in productivity. So that's what he said in 1993, but we, in fact, were experiencing it and then thinking about it. I mean, how to improve our productivity. That, in fact, was something we were already thinking about in Korea back in late 1980s. So even if we did it partly because of the pressure coming from abroad, but in a sense, we were feeling the need to go in the direction of further liberalization. So it was the happy, say, in fact, meeting of pressure coming from abroad, and then the need we felt from home. So that is the reason why, as I already told you, had it been the case that it was simply the outside pressure, then Korea would not have done it in the way we did it. We would have to try to do it just to the extent that we could deal with the pressure coming from abroad. Then it could have ended up by leaving more, well, in a sense, negative side effects. But somehow it was the, well, meeting of external pressure as well as internal needs. So that is the reason why, in my mind, the liberalization had far more, say, positive impacts upon Korean economic development rather than negative impact.
So thank you for that answer. Apart from that, you were also describing your thoughts about the critics saying that South Korea might have been premature for the accession for the OECD in 1996, right? But you thought it was, from my understanding, it was not premature, and that you were ready for the entrance. So if that was not the reason for the primary reason for the crisis happening in '97, what would then be the primary reason? Would you say?
Well, again, a very interesting question because the financial crisis, Asian financial crisis, happened in 1997, and 1997, I was working for Korean mission to the OECD. 1999, I in fact was moved from France to Geneva, and I was working for Korean mission to the WTO, from OECD to the WTO. And in the fall of 1999, then there is an UN body called ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. And ECOSOC, 1 year they meet in New York. That's even-numbered years. And next year they meet in Geneva. That's odd-numbered years. So in 1999, ECOSOC met in Geneva. And then there was something called interactive panel. And the theme for that interactive panel was the lessons of Asian financial crisis. That was the title for the whole session, interactive session in the fall of 1999. And I told you about my interest in Asian financial crisis. And then, of course, I just went there and was sitting in the hall, huge hall, right? That's something called the UNOG, United Nations Office in Geneva. And then there was a hall called Hall of Nations. And that is the largest hall at the UNOG. And I was there. And then there were several panelists. And then one of the panelists said, well, in order to learn the lesson from Asian financial crisis, we should understand why financial crisis happened. And then he said, well, of course there are a large number of causes, but in my mind, there was a single most important reason for the financial crisis in Asia, which was corruption of government officials. And then he said it. And I was just looking at him. And I said to myself, I'm a government official coming from Korea. What is he talking about? Is he saying my corruption was responsible for the Korean financial crisis? And I said to myself, well, whatever I say, I must respond. So, well, there was my country card. And then at the United Nations, then if you want to speak, then you just raise your flag, right? So I just raised my flag. And after the panelists were done, then I was the first to given an opportunity to respond. So I said to myself, how much time do I have? Maybe 10 minutes, right? And then within those 10 minutes, I must come up with something smart to respond to him. If I say, well, panelist, I don't agree with you, then it will be parallel, his words against my words, right? So it will be, at the best, it will be an even game, right? So I said to myself, well, I in fact must say something smart, right? Fortunately, something smart came up in my mind. That was, again, I'm talking about Paul Krugman too often today, but Paul Krugman, he in fact wrote a very interesting essay in The Economist magazine, and then he was just pondering on the causes of Asian financial crisis. And then what he said was the cause of Asian financial crisis, that is Pangloss syndrome. Anyone familiar with Pangloss? Anyone familiar with the Candide? You're familiar with Candide, right? That's a novel written by Voltaire, right? Candide, in that novel, Candide, Pangloss is the name of his tutor of Candide. And then in that novel, Candide, the personalities in the novel, they represent certain human characteristics. Pangloss, the tutor of Candide, the human trait he represents is groundless optimism. Optimism is good, but at the same time, what he represents, that's groundless optimism. And Paul Krugman, he said, But in Asia, everybody were panglosses. Bankers, they thought if you lend money, then he will be able to, well, make a good profit out of it. Businessmen, when I borrow money and invest it, then, well, there will be no failure. I will make money. Government officials, they encouraged bankers, they encouraged businessmen to make bigger investment without any concern about cash flow, right? So everybody was pangloss. They didn't think about the consequence. They didn't think about things going wrong. They kept on investing. That, in fact, was the cause of Asian financial crisis. And I read it and I said to myself, that sounds very plausible. Because in Korea, at the time, we were saying, big horses never fail. The bigger the horse is, then the better the lower the chance of failure will be. So we were investing and investing and investing. We were not thinking too much about how to, in fact, take care in case there is something going wrong. We were not doing that. We were not taking sufficient precautions, right? So I just read Paul Krugman's article, and I said to myself, that in my mind, of course at the time I was reading large number of analytical materials on the causes of financial crisis. And then to me, it sounded most plausible. If I have to come up with a single explanation about the Asian financial crisis, I said to myself, that sounds most plausible. So what I said in that ECOSOC meeting was this, which is that, well, there was one panelist who said the cause of Asian financial crisis, that is the corruption of government officials. And I, in fact, am a government official coming from Asia. And because of it, I, of course, have given a lot of thoughts to this issue. And there are all different kinds of explanations, but if I have to come up with one single explanation, that will be what we learned from Paul Krugman. And then Paul Krugman said, maybe the most important explanation could be Pangloss effect. And I just looked around the whole of nations, and I said, I hope you understand what Pangloss effect is, right? And then I explained about what Pangloss effect is. And then I wrapped up by saying, well, we learned an important lesson, so we will no longer be Panglosses. And I stopped. People began to applaud. And people began to stand up. Whole audience, they just stood up, something called standing ovation. And I felt extremely gratified. So that will be my answer. Pangloss effect. And then I think we learned the lesson. And our banks became sounder. Our corporates became sounder. Well, I have to confess to you, at the time, back in 1997, the average debt ratio for a large number of Korean companies, you will be surprised, it was 800%. 800%, 8 times more debt than your capital. That was the capital structure of a large number of Korean companies at the time. These days, well, there are very few of them who, in fact, would have debt ratio of more than 200%. $2 of debt to $1 of capital, right? So, in fact, there was a huge change in our banking sector, in our corporate sector, in our labor reform, in our public sector reform. So that's what we did in 1998, and that's the reason why I said we learned a big lesson, and we will no longer be Panglosses.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.